the oldest member of the faculty, except me, of course, who, when we started doing the, actually organizing colorectal games since, how many, 14 years ago.
Well, thank you, Evangelos, to be here again. And I think we have to correct one little thing, and that's the first meeting was not in 2004, but in 2005. And these are all the meetings we had, and these are a selection of all the presentations I used to give. And you see that I'm changing. I'm changing from my practice as colorectal surgeon to now curricula, quality control, and I will tell you now about training, what my personal opinion is. Well, I have one disclaimer. I'm the medical director of Incision. Now we have to realize that traditionally this is the way we are all were trained. It was the master apprentices, it was passive learning, learning on the job, and it was famous to tell, see one, do one, teach one.
Yes.
And what's the problem, and it's even today a problem, once a master, always a master. Who is having successfully trained for the old techniques, what you are doing? Of course, when you introduce TME, you will be proctored. But for a normal CME or TME, what you're doing already for 5 or 10 years, is anybody ever looking at you what you are doing? I think that has to be changed in the new way of learning. And I will tell you a little bit about my opinion about how the new way of learning could look. And that's long life learning. That's completely different. And new techniques are based on competences. It's active learning. It's learning off the job. You should not learn on your patients. You should first have your theoretical and then go to the skills lab and do, after you have been trained, a continuous evaluation of your performance. In this lecture I will give you some ideas or some personal ideas about the challenges and possible solutions in surgical training. Then I will go as an example in the curriculum of the ESCP to see what is happening over there, and then go to e-learning, how we could make programs for colorectal surgeons, how we could train with models in Skills Lab, and how we can do, finally, continuously competence tracking in the theatre. Challenges in surgical training, that's up-to-date knowledge, that's one of the biggest ones. There's an enormous increase of knowledge, and we hardly know how to implement this in our daily practice. And as soon as a book is printed, it's outdated, and that's a problem that we have these days. Now, for surgery there comes a second very big problem, then that's the balance between evidence and experience. You can say we will do a study about bad surgery and TME, that study will be never done. That was not done when we started with TME. As soon as you have a good experience, sometimes you have to accept that as a kind of evidence, and that's what's happening in surgery a lot. Only 50% of what we are doing is evidence-based. We have to look very carefully what's now happening in training, that we shift from open to robotic. But on the other hand, who will know after 10 years how open surgery was done in that day era? So we should to document it. And we have a lack of integrated surgical anatomical knowledge. Planes were not trained by the anatomist. It was about muscles, it was about nerves, it was about vessels, but the anatomical planes, they were not there. So what can be the solutions? I think one of the biggest solutions is to use the international guidelines and use experienced surgeons who can tell you the experience from the past and learn all the techniques. And when you don't learn one technique, have at least a kind of information source that you can look at the open situation and use interactive 3D anatomical models. Now there's more, and I look this at a global scale. I'm not looking this from the perspective of Western Europe, but from the global. Manpower. In general, we have a lack of surgeons. And when there's a lack of surgeons, we have no trainers enough. Of course, this holds not true for the Netherlands and from Germany, but I think in general, when you look all over the world, when you look in Africa, in Indonesia, there's an enormous lack of trainers because the surgeons are doing their surgical work and they don't have time for training. And if they train, there's too much training on the job. And there's another thing that is happening, and it's happening especially in Africa, there's task shifting to other health professionals. When the midwives are starting to do the cesarean sections, you have to train them properly. But who will train them? Now there are solutions. You can, in my opinion, have capacity building by e-learning. And that's not what's happening in Indonesia when they have to go back from 6 years training to 4 years. That's the only possibility, is to have a massive introduction of e-learning modules. And train. You should not train on the patient, but train both in low-cost models but also with new technology. And have it useful for all the disciplines. When you make a kind of module, you can, for the obstetricians, you can use the same model for the midwives. Or you can use it for the physician assistants. Now the final idea about challenging surgical training is quality. And there's a need for training and patient safety. That's quite clear. And that's learning with continuous improvement. And how will you organize this in your own department? And we have to learn to communicate. Of course, we have many trainings now between anesthetists and surgeons, but who is training the scrub nurse and the resident? Who is that they are doing the same step-by-step method? So the solutions can be crew resource management, identify your errors and try to improve them, and start with speaking one language. And that means standardization. That's a difficult word for surgeons, standardization, but I think that in the end, it's the only solution if we all use the same techniques and the same step-by-step method. Now when I look, for example, to this, then you can see that part 1 of the EBSQ coloproctology examination is eligibility. So that's only information you get by the applicant by himself. Of course it's supervised, but there's no information about the quality. And then you have the actual exam, that's only for 2 hours, and that's not much. It does not much because you ask in the curriculum a lot. You ask, for example, the basic knowledge about science, and that's all written down here. You ask of all the diseases, you ask information that they know about it. And you ask for the skills, for the technical competence. And I'm rather sure that when you have a report on what they have been doing, that it is not sufficient to convince you that they have sufficient knowledge. So, in general, there's no information about the standardization of procedures. It can be very well that even within one department, surgeons do it in a quite different way. There is no information about structured learning, about programs and testing after learning. There's no information about how they have been trained in the skills lab. And there's no information about the quality of their performance in the theater. So, in general, I think when we look at a training module, and I just take the ECP as an example, I have all the details, but I just give you some general thoughts about it. It's quantification and no insight into quality. Now, one of the first steps in surgery should be a standardization. And that means that you describe an operation step by step. And of course this is not new, this has been done for centuries. When you look in the guidelines, you hardly see any step-by-step description. Because it's all about diagnostics and workup. And then there's a general description of the procedure, but not in a very detailed way, step by step. And I will show you the example I developed. And that will be published in the British Journal of Surgery Open. You have a step, and that's a sequence of actions of different anatomical structures in the same surgical region to reach a goal. And that's feedback and the circle of quality. You start with something, you have the idea, you have to open the abdomen. And you encounter different anatomical structures. And as soon as you have entered the abdomen, you can do the evaluation. Was the incision of enough length? Was it long enough? Was it in good position? And then you have the sub-steps, and then you make the sub-steps always on an anatomical structure or an implant with an action. So you can have a verb. So you can have the skin incise, fascia incise, but a vessel can be mobilized. And we made a list of 40 verbs that were checked internationally, so that you can have every time the same verb always on an anatomical structure. And that means that when you describe every operation in this way, you have a very standardized way of description of your operation. And these are the way you can do it with your surgical steps. Now, since we are working on with anatomical structures, we have to be aware that we need interactive anatomy. So we need a lot of attention for good interactive anatomy, where you can have inlays, where you can even say here in the hand, you can see how the screw is moving in the correct position to treat a scaphoid fracture, or you can have an interactive model here with your abdominal wall. Since you are, with the step-by-step method, operating on anatomical structures, you have to describe your anatomical structures as good as possible. And when you go to the web and go for a model, it looks fine. But if you look in detail, it is not fine. So you really have to put a lot of efforts in it to really make the model good. We have one model and we have modified nearly 50% of all the structures to be sure that they are in the right position. So this all comes together, and with high quality 3D films on every device for every setting, and it doesn't matter if you're living in Africa or Indonesia or in Europe, you always have the same standard. And so you can make the step-by-step surgical guides. And that should be the base of standardized and structured learning. And now, for example, you can see what you can do with this. We have a collaboration with the ESSO, and as soon as they have an educational course, and this is for liver surgery, we provide them with the proper instruction material, and here you can see how the fellow or the resident was doing what he was supposed to do before he is going to the course. Now this is the example, but because now we come back to colorectal disease. This is the program we are running in the Netherlands for the Dutch gastrointestinal group. They made a program for all the residents in their 5th and 6th year to be sure that they meet the same standard for operations. And that's a very practical course, that's on the cadaver course. But before they go to that course, they have to study. They have to study anatomy, colon resections and rectal resections. So together with the faculty, and these are 3 days, with the faculty we defined what was necessary for the theoretical knowledge of all these courses. Because you can imagine when you go to a cadaveric course and you do not know where the anatomic plexus is, in theory, you ruin the whole cadaver already in the beginning, because you start cutting without knowing. So you should learn in advance and pass a test. So here you can see for the trainers, you have an insight in any individual trainee, what they have been doing and if they have completed their courses before they can go to another course. And of course you should always test. And train with models. I'm fond these days of models. We should train more and more on models, and that can be done on all different ways. And of course I'm not restricting it only to colorectal, but you can make low-cost models that are very realistic and have courses with this. And you don't need always expensive courses of models, because they can be made locally only for a little bit of money. And I'm rather sure that for colorectal cancer it can be made as well. But of course you can also train with augmented reality. You should not restrict yourself to the simple models, but training with augmented reality is a great possibility to have the feeling what you are doing in a film. And I can show you the examples, but I did not bring it here because you should have it in 3D with the HoloLens, how you can manipulate with your hands in an anatomical model and even simulate operations. It has, of course, the disadvantages. It will never imitate the real operation. And of course, the final part of the training before you go to the patient is training either with cadaveric dissections or, for example, with laparoscopic training boxes. There are so many steps before you can go to the patient. And in the past, when you were just called and say, well, you go tomorrow to the theater, what we are going to do? Well, you will assist a hernia. And then during the scrubbing they said, well, you can start and see how far you can go. And then after the skin and after the first nerve, that then they say, well, I will take over. That's of course absolutely obsolete when you go to the new way of training. And after training, you have to follow the competence of the trainee, both in the skills lab and in the theater. First of all, you can see if they passed the test, if they executed it or observed, and then you score, and I will give you a few examples of that. It first starts again with a description of the step-by-step, because if you don't have that, you cannot identify the key tasks and hazards, you cannot do the error identification, and then you have the impact. So you segment an operation, say a cold section, you divide it in 5 or 6 steps, and every step has some hazards, and during your procedure you identify if you did it, either you did not follow the procedure in the correct order, or you did a wrong execution, and you did do an impact analysis on the patient level. So a small bleeding will probably not have an impact on the patient level, and you score it in a different way when you do this for a urethra lesion. Quantification, error reduction, and this means that you go back. Here you go back for all the errors within a society, a big society like the European Society of Coloproctology, and you see how you have to reverse your step by step, and here you can do it on an institutional level. And finally, you will have these kind of curves that when you say, well, when somebody is proficient, it depends also on the number of operations you are doing, and nobody knows if this is 5 or 10 or 15 or 20. And it can be different for different doctors, and it can be different procedures. And we can learn a lot about it if we start implementing this and continue measuring this. And then as a trainer, you can have insight in the competences of all your residents. Now, this is to finalize and show how this can be done, and this can be done, it could be done all over Europe because it's available at this moment. You have your smartphone, everything is playing on your smartphone. First you say, did you execute it or observe it? Then you have, here for example, is the open appendectomy. Then you say how many steps you have been doing as a resident. Well, I was allowed to do 2 steps. What happened with these 2 steps? I made 1 error, then you go in the sub-step and see what, in which sub-step you made the error. Then you describe if this was executional or procedural, and if it has consequences for the patient, yes or no. And this all you record, because what's normal you do not record. We have the tendency in medicine to record everything that's normal. The patient slept very well, this is normal. If the patient was not sleeping, that is abnormal. And we have the tendency to describe endlessly what is normal. And then you go to your the supervisor, and the supervisor approves it. And then the supervisor has his dashboard where he can see what the students did. Here he approves it, and here he has an overview what all this is doing. So can you imagine when you should introduce this within Europe for all the ones who are a fellow and wants to go to the exam, that you know exactly all the procedures and what they did and what they did wrong, and how they did their theoretical learning. And in my opinion, this is the new way of learning. Standardization for residents, surgeons and scrub nurses with knowledge of anatomy, with skills labs in cheap and advanced, and testing before competence tracking after the operation. So what could, for example, be the solution of the ESCP, in my opinion? It's a personal solution. No idea of the quality of standard. Yes, we can start by making one international standardization of key procedures. No idea about structured learning. Yes, we can introduce a monthly European training program, including a skills lab. It's not so difficult to make and have it all over Europe the same. Know about the quality of the performance in the theatre. Yes, you can have when you introduce competence tracking based on steps on an international level. Thank you very much for that.
Thanks very much, Steve. I think that I don't know if there are any comments or questions on the issue of training. There could be a long of discussion for hours. I think that we should move towards incorporating all this methodology of training in colorectal surgery at a rather European and not national or institutional level, which is actually the actual situation today. And I think as you are involved in training and with the SCP, we should somehow popularize and Europanize, if I may say so, the training curriculum and unify it. I know it's very difficult. There are a lot of problems to tackle, and I don't know if you can succeed in the near future.